let me go ahead and, before I forget, and talk about the final just a little bit. Uh, I know you guys here in class, you're not taking the final unless you just want to take the final. I can give you a good old grade. Anyway, I'm going to make it easy on you. I think I'm going to make it easy on you. The test is basically going to be one question. Um, I want you to be prepared to, and I don't know how I'm going to word the question just yet, uh, but I want you to be prepared to connect the dots in the book of Daniel. I want you to tell me about the theme of the book of Daniel and how each chapter or each segment of the book, if you don't want to break it down in chapters, that's okay. If you want to break it in sections, however you want to do that, I want you to uh, connect the dots of the theme of Daniel, the purpose of Daniel, and how chapter 1, for example, fits into that purpose, how chapter 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and in these last chapters, chapters 7 through 12, how they fit into the purpose of Daniel. I don't expect you to give me all the details of dates and names and all that we've been talking about over the last few weeks. What I want you to do is give me a substantial understanding of your understanding of the purpose of the book of Daniel and how the different details of the book fit into that. If you want to collect chapters 10, 11, and 12 into one segment and say this fits into Daniel's purpose in this way, that's fine. I don't care. I just need to know that you understand what was written in chapters 10, 11, and 12 and how that fits in with the stated purpose or your studied understanding of the purpose of the book of Daniel. Concerning that purpose, let me read to you from the book that I gave you as a text in page 71. No, that's not the right book. This is Butler's Bible study textbook on Daniel by Butler, and it's College Press. You can get it online. It's free. You can download it online, and that's one of the reasons I gave it to you, because it was free. And also, I wanted you to have it for a different perspective than what we were going to be studying throughout the text. A large part of the text that we've studied has been from Brother Turner, Rex Turner, but I didn't follow him completely, and also from a guy by the name of King. I forget his first name. But let me read to you real quickly from page 5 of Butler's book. He says, purpose. Leupold writes, a book of comfort designed for evil days as well as for good days. By the help of it, Israel could discern that its oppressions were indeed going to be heavy, but on the other hand, that they were foreknown by God and were therefore not to be dreaded too much. For if an all-knowing God had seen what would transpire, he must at the same time be an omnipotent God who would be able to deliver his own, as well as a faithful God who would not suffer them to be tempted above what they were able. He continues by quoting Gleason Archer, saying, the overruling sovereignty of the one true God who condemns and destroys the rebellious world power and faithfully delivers his covenant people according to the steadfast faith in him. On the next page, he quotes G. Campbell Morgan, saying, if I were to summarize the book of Daniel, I could do it in 2 sentences. First of all, the messages of Daniel, whether they were delivered to pagan kings or to those recorded that have been for the people of God, emphasize first the government of God over all kings and nations, and secondly, they emphasize the fact of the continuity of the government until the consummation in which God's will shall be done, his throne recognized, and the victory be with him. Butler says Dr. Morgan's pen of Daniel is well stated. I am so glad in these days I have my Old Testament still, and I'm watching the goodness of God in human history over the machinations of men. In the next paragraph, he says, God presides, this is Butler speaking, God presides over the history of the world. The Gentile nations, as well as the Jews, have always been under his control. The succession of human empires is ordained by him. He permits the pride and fury of oppressors for a time, but humbles them in the end and saves his own. His kingdom will come in due time and will endure forever. Faithfulness and constancy to him lead to a life beyond death, to an eternal reward of glory. So that's kind of a summation of his, well, it's a statement, I guess, not a summation of his purpose of the book of Daniel. And I wanted to read to you from Truth Commentary, written by Mr. King, or Brother King. I got to pull it up here. This, again, is also available online for free, and I forget the exact website that I got it from. But he has several pages written on the purpose of
you got the Truth Commentary for free?
I did, so I guess you can.
I had to pay $30 for that.
No, you got Truth for the Day, Joe.
Oh.
That's a different commentary, and I don't know who the author of that Truth for the Day is. I know it's written by members of the church, but I don't know who the particular author of that particular book is. This is called Truth. This is called Truth Commentary. In a minute, I'll give you the source of it, or at least the title of the book. But I wanted to read to you the purpose and theology of the work, and just give you some bullet points that he gives. Number one, he says, Daniel stresses the providential working of God in history during the dark days of captivity. Point number two, oh boy, I just lost it. I got to get to page 73, and I'm on page what? 77. Number two, Daniel seeks to show the superiority of the God of Israel over the gods of the heathen nation. And number three, I wrote it down, he says, it's on page 75, Daniel attempts to provide a survey, part historical and part prophetic, of the whole period of Gentile imperial rule from Nebuchadnezzar's first assault on Jerusalem and the abolition of the David, I guess that's Davidic king. Let me find that. Abolition of the Davidic king until the setting up of the Messianic kingdom. So that was his 3 bullet points, and he writes several pages on that concerning the purpose of Daniel. We need to understand, for the final, you need to have a grasp in your own words, in your own thinking, what is the purpose of Daniel, and see how chapter 11, for example, fits into that purpose. See how chapter 1, the story of the boys in Babylon, how that fits into that purpose. Why did God tell us that? Why did he tell us that in Daniel? And what was he telling the Jews of the time that we're going to read that? And what was he telling Mike Underwood in the 21st century? I'm not looking for a thesis. I just want to know, do you understand the purpose of the book of Daniel and how each chapter fits into that purpose? Does that make sense, Joe?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. Daniel, what do you think? Have I got you there?
Yes, I think it makes sense too.
Okay, that's what I'm looking for on the final. I'll put that in words and on paper, or not paper, but send you an email about that, and that'll be your final test or final examination, because I'm not going to require you to remember all these dates and facts and places and names. They are wonderful if you can put those in your brain, put those in your memory, and understand, watch what God is doing in history as he does those things. But because there is so much I won't say confusion, but so many differences that you'll get from different scholars, even conservative good scholars. Like I'm reading three, or been reading three throughout this course, Brother Turner, Brother King, and Butler, as well as also a couple more that I've got. You know, all three or four or five of them, good men, good and godly men, and great teachers of God's word, and they'll find that they differ on some particular particularities or peculiarities about the book, and some of them differ drastically as far as concerning the end time. That some of the things that we'll talk about, and we won't get a chance to do that in chapter 12. But what I want you to do is, I'm not looking for you rehearsing all those facts with me on the test. I want you to tell me, how does it fit in with the purpose? How does Daniel 11, whatever it means, whatever the prediction is, and however it was fulfilled, why did God give me that? Why is God just trying to make us history students here and study our history books so that we can see that? What is God doing? If that's what he's doing, then tell me that. But if there's a higher purpose, I'd like to know what that is in your understanding. Is that fair?
Sounds fair.
Is that consistent with what we've been studying? And that's what I want to do, is make sure I've been getting the point, not just telling you the stories, but getting the point of those stories to you. I hope it's
yeah, I'm still confused. That's great.
Sounds good to me.
Okay. Well, I hope I'm asking that question on the test because I'm hoping that I've been able to accomplish helping you understand how that, not just telling the stories or giving the history, but what does it mean, and how does it fit in with the ultimate purpose of the Bible, as well as the ultimate purpose of Daniel. Daniel chapter 11 is where we are. We left off in verse 15. I'll review very quickly, very abruptly, to get us back to that point. How to do that? The first three verses talk about the several kings that get us to King Artaxerxes, and then it talks about Alexander the Great. We're not trying to focus on, Daniel's not trying to focus on them. The vision is not trying to focus on them. The vision is to get us to to Artaxerxes the Fourth, but in order to do that, he's got to fill in at least some details in the 200 or 300 years of history that he's kind of passing over. So after Alexander the Great, eventually there were four kings that were fighting over world power at the time. Two of them he focuses on. One is the king of Egypt, or called the king of the south. And who were the kings of the south? They were help me out.
Ptolemies.
Ptolemies, thank you. They were the Ptolemies. And then there were the kings of the north, who were called the Seleucids. They're from Syria. They also, the names changed from Seleucia to Antiochus, back and forth, but they're of the same family. So he talks about those, trying to get us to understand who they are and how they are affected, or how they affect the children of God. And that's the main reason for bringing them up, is he wants to show how these kings, these two nations, these two kingdoms affected the children of God, or were affected by the children of God. The other two generals from Alexander the Great didn't have any, or very little effect anyway, on the Jewish kingdom, or the Jewish people, so he doesn't focus on them. They're just as active during this period of history, but God's not focusing our attention on them in this book, or in these visions. Let's see. Verses 1 through 3, we talked about Xerxes, we talked about Alexander. Verse 3, the mighty king shall arise, is Alexander. In verse 4, there's when he has arisen, his kingdom shall be broken up and divided. That's the 11 kings, turned out to be 8 kings, turned out to be 4 kings, as far as eventually it all worked out. It shook down to 4 kings. Also, verse 5, the king of the south, that's Ptolemy, shall become strong, as well as one of his princes. That'll be Seleucus, and he's considered one of the princes because Seleucus was one of the generals, but he got involved with a war with Antigonus, and Antigonus was whooping him around a little bit, so he ran for cover down in Egypt, became one of the princes there under Ptolemy. But then it says he, that is Seleucus, will gain power over him, that is Ptolemy, and he shall have dominion, and his dominion shall be a great dominion. So these are the two kings, king of the south, king of the north, and the king of the north is the one who will gain power and gain power over him, have a great dominion. Verses 6 and following are going to talk about the different Syrian wars, Syrian war number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. And I'm not going to go back into all that detail. Hopefully that your notes will take care of that rather than us trying to review all of that again. And that's going to bring us down to verse 15. We are in Syrian war number 5, or the 5th Syrian war, around 200 BC. And so the king, verse 15, the king of the north shall come and build a siege mound and take a fortified city, and the forces of the south shall not withstand him. Even his choice troops shall have no strength to resist, but he who comes against him shall do according to his will, and no one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land with destruction in his power. He shall also set his face to enter with the strength of his whole kingdom, and upright ones with him. Thus shall he do, and he shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she shall not stand with him or before him. So in the 5th Syrian war, Egypt is being dominated by the Syrians again, or at least they're in a fight again. They stayed in fights all the time, and on this occasion, the Syrians are beating up on the Egyptians. The Egyptians sign a peace treaty with Antiochus III, who is the king in Syria, in 195 BC. Back in verse 14, before that took place, there was a time when the Ptolemies were at least successful in the Palestinian area, and because the Jews in Palestine had thrown their vote or favor with Antiochus, Seleucus came in, and he really beat up on the Jewish nation. But after that, Syria gained power, and Egypt becomes subservient somewhat anyway to Syria, Antiochus the third. And according to, or in fulfillment of these verses in that peace treaty that Egypt is signing, he grants Syria, or Syria has taken control of Palestine, and Seleucus agrees to marry Antiochus III's daughter. Anybody know her name? Antiochus III's daughter. That Seleucus, or I'm sorry, that I said Seleucus, I meant Ptolemy.
Starts with a B.
Bernice is one that was she was in the picture earlier on, back in verse 6 and 7. That's when Bernice and Laodice were in contention. This is a different one. This is a different woman. Her name is Cleopatra.
No, Cleopatra.
Cleopatra I is the daughter of Antiochus the third, and Antiochus forces in this peace treaty Ptolemy the fifth to marry her. The name Cleopatra means glory of the father. Cleopatra, Patra father, Cleo means glory, or glory of the father. So she's Cleopatra number 1. Antiochus had hoped that this marriage between his daughter and Ptolemy Ptolemy V would gain the Egyptians' fidelity. Not only do I want to be your king by dominance, but if I get you married to me, or if you're my in-laws, then you're going to be more faithful to me, and not because you have to, but because you are my family now. However, it didn't work out that way. It says down in verse 17, and she shall give him. No, that's not where I wanted to go. Verse 16, but he who comes against him shall do according to his own will. No one shall stand against him. He shall stand in the glorious land. Where is the verse I'm looking for? Verse 15. Forces, no. He shall give him the daughter of women to destroy it, but she, verse 17, but she shall not stand with him or be for him. What Antiochus hoped was that Cleopatra's marriage to Ptolemy #5 would endear him to Antiochus, but it did not. In fact, she was more faithful to her husband than she was to her father, and she encouraged Ptolemy V to not ally with Antiochus III, but rather to ally with Rome, and that's what he did. Cleopatra and Ptolemy V, not anything about the text, but they had 3 kids. One was Ptolemy VI, one was Ptolemy VII, and one was Cleopatra #2. And that is neither here nor there. I just thought that was an interesting tidbit. Number 18, verse 18. After this, he, that is Antiochus III, after this, Antiochus III shall turn his face. Now remember, Daniel's looking 200 or 300 years in prophecy, so he's not putting these names in here because he doesn't know them. I'm putting the name there because I'm trying to help you connect the dots there. After this, Antiochus III shall turn his face to the coastlands and shall take many, but a ruler shall bring reproach against them to an end. And with the reproach removed, he shall turn back on him. Then he shall turn his face toward the fortress of his own land, but he shall stumble, fall, and not be found. Rome, the gathering storm of Rome at that time, they sanctioned Philip V of Greece. Remember, maybe last week we talked about how Philip V of Greece and Alexander III of Syria joined forces to do a little beating up on Egypt, and Rome says you need to stop that. You don't need to go any further, and they they did because they didn't want to get in a tangle with Rome. And here in this text, or according to history anyway, Rome, because of his involvement with Antiochus, he sanctioned Philip V of Greece for his part in the invasions in Egypt, and they limited Philip V's reign or dominion to Macedonia. But when he did that, or when Rome did that, a lot of the lands that the Grecian king was or did have dominion over were kind of freed up, including the coastlands or the islands, and that's what he says here in the verse 18. After this, Antiochus shall turn his face to the coastlands. Why? Because Rome had basically freed him up from the dominion of Philip, and so Antiochus says, well, it's up for grabs, so he goes in and tries to grab them, and does do that. But he went too far, Antiochus did, when he went into Thrace. Now, you need to look at your map to see how this is working out, but he went into Thrace, which is getting a little bit too close to Rome, and Rome says you're going to stop. He sent ambassadors, Rome did, to Antiochus and says you need to stop where you are, don't go any further. And Antiochus basically said, I don't tell you what to do in Europe, you don't tell me what to do in Asia. And the Roman ambassador, he went back home, told the authorities that in power what was going on there, and they didn't like it a whole lot. The way that Antiochus was treating him. He was eventually forced to sign a treaty with Rome requiring him to submit as a vassal to Rome, pay a large indemnity for all the problems he had caused. To keep him out of trouble, they took 20 hostages from Antiochus III, including 2 of his own sons, one of which was Antiochus IV, which is the very person that we're trying to get to. He's the one that most of the remaining part of the chapter is talking about, the one that Daniel, or the angel, is trying to get Daniel to see or to prophesy about. Antiochus, it says he stumbled and fell and he was not found. He went back home. He couldn't do anything. He didn't have an army. He had to pay all of his money, all the money he could get in taxes. He eventually became a robber of temples, and that so discredited him among everyone that he just came to nothing. Seleucus IV was the second-born son to Antiochus III. He's the one who inherited the throne when Antiochus III died. He reigned for 12 years. He's called the tax collector. Look at verse 20. There shall arise in his place, his is Antiochus III, after he's dead, there shall arise in his place one who imposes taxes on the glorious kingdom, but within a few days he shall be destroyed, but not in anger and battle. He's called the tax collector because that's what Seleucus did. When he inherited the throne from his father, he inherited all of his father's debts, and he had to pay them to Rome, and so he did that by raising taxes on every place that he could, including the glorious kingdom. The glorious kingdom would be what? Verse 20, who would be the glorious kingdom?
Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Jerusalem is the glorious kingdom, or the Jews, the nation of the Jews, is the glorious kingdom in this case. You're right when you say the church is the glorious kingdom. It is the most glorious kingdom, but in this context here, he's talking about the Jews. Verse 20 also speaks of an attempt of Seleucus to rob the Jerusalem temple. He became a robber of temples like his dad did. He had to pay the taxes somehow to Rome, so he became a robber of temples, and he sent his prime minister, Heliodorus. Heliodorus, that's a nice name, isn't it? How'd you like to name your son? Heliodorus. Helio, what does it mean?
Helio.
Helio, think about it. What does it mean? Heliodorus.
Upright. Helio, upright.
No, it's a Greek word. It's going to have to do with the sun. And the word Doros, the word Doro or Doru or Doros is the word gift. So Heliodorus is the gift of the sun. Not important. I just like the study of names. You ought to always look and see what your name means, where your name comes from, and see what it means. It's your name for a reason. But at any rate, according to the book of 2nd Maccabees, Heliodorus was spooked by a vision that he had in Jerusalem of angels or horsemen, golden armored horsemen in full attack mode. He was so spooked by that he ran back home to Syria, but he didn't take any booty from the temple with him. Verse 21, and in his place, that is in Seleucus IV's place, shall arise a vile person, to whom they will not give the honor of royalty, but he shall come in peaceably. The word peaceably there is probably better translated as unexpectedly. So think about it in that way. He shall come in unexpectedly and seize the kingdom by intrigue. He did not come in peaceably because he came in murdering. The he there is Antiochus IV. In his place shall arise a vile person. That vile person is Antiochus IV, the subject of chapter 11. We just now get to him in verse 21 because Daniel needed to know all the preliminaries in order to understand who this guy was and why he was like he was. Seleucus was assassinated. Historians debate whether or not Antiochus IV was a part of that. Antiochus IV was actually being released from Rome about that time, or because of that time. I'm not sure which. Depends on the historian that you read. But some say that he was involved in the murder or the assassination of Seleucus IV. And when he got there, Heliodorus had taken the throne, but when Antiochus finally got to Syria from Rome, he killed Heliodorus. He also killed his younger brother, who might have claim to the throne. and he had him killed as well. It says by intrigue. King says the word intrigue means cunning or full of compliments and bribes. He said he also flattered the common people of Syria. King is quoting from someone, and I forget who. I think maybe from Herodotus. He also, this is Antiochus IV, he flattered the common people of Syria. He was every man's companion. He resorted to common shops and prattled with the workmen. He frequented the common taverns. He ate and drank with the meanest of fellows. He and singing debauched songs. Does that sound like anybody you know of in the Bible besides Antiochus IV?
Yeah.
There's a guy in uh, David's kingdom who was working behind the scenes, working the people, so to speak, trying to get in Absalom, David's son, kind of did the same thing, trying to take the kingdom by intrigue, by bribes, by you can't get any good things from my dad. Let me tell you what I can do for you. Well, that's what this guy Antiochus IV was doing as well. He wasn't coming in a domineering way. I'm going to beat you to death if you don't let me be your king. He kind of just worked the people somewhat. Let me read to you a quote. And I got this out of King's book, but I'm not sure if I'm quoting King. I think I'm quoting King, quoting somebody else. He says Antiochus IV Epiphanes provides another lesson in divine justice and even of divine deliverance. What distinguishes him is that he attempted to unify his kingdom by imposing a particular religious and cultural ideology on those who were his subjects. Nebuchadnezzar did the same thing in chapter 3 of Daniel, or a similar thing in Daniel chapter 3. Antiochus, he says, would make his religion the primary instrument for the imposition of his will on the subject peoples, especially the Jews. And through this would precipitate a conflict between the commitment. Here's the point I wanted to get to. He would precipitate a conflict between the commitment to God and eternal truth and the worldly, wise, unscrupulous way of life advocated by diplomacy. Put yourself in the faithful Jew's position. Antiochus comes in and says, we are going to follow Grecian gods or the Grecian way of doing things, and if you don't like it, your other option is death. Your other option is being persecuted to death. Your other option is humiliation. So if you're a faithful Jew and you're in that situation, what are you going to do? Well, if we're a faithful Christian and we're in a situation today in the 21st century and the government, I'm not saying that's happening, but the government is forcing us to bow to a certain philosophy or theology, and we're a faithful Christian and we won't bow, we won't bend like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, what are we going to do? Well, it's a good chance we're going to get killed. We're going to have to go into hiding. We're going to have to. Well, that's what's taking place here. These people, the Jewish people, if they were faithful. Now, unfaithful Jews weren't put in a position. They'll do what they have to survive, or they don't care. And there were those among the Jews that didn't care, that weren't faithful, and they actually became a problem. And it's probably one of the reasons that Antiochus is there in the first place. But if you're a faithful Jew, you're put in a conflict between being faithful to God and the eternal truth, or being faithful or compromising to worldly, wise, unscrupulous way of life advocated by diplomacy, as King says here. As a result of this unequal struggle, the people of the Lord were destined to endure times of intense suffering, and their faith would be tested to the limit. That's the point of Daniel chapter 11. That's all these facts and figures, all these prophetic facts and figures that Daniel is trying to, or the angel is trying to get Daniel to see, is for helping those that are coming in the next 200 or 300 years to understand it's going to get hot in here and you need to be ready for it. You need to be prepared for it. Some of them weren't prepared because they didn't study the book of Daniel. They didn't listen to what, it's like the Christians of the time when Rome came in 70 AD to destroy Jerusalem. If a Christian was destroyed in Jerusalem, whose fault was it? It was the Christian. Why? he had information. Matthew 24, Jesus says, get out. When you see the flags waving, when you see them coming, and I'm telling you what it's going to look like, and he gave them all kind of reasons, the signs of the times that we read about in Matthew 24 that the premillennialists want to say it's about the end of the world. It's not about the end of the world. It's about the coming of Rome against Jerusalem. When you see these signs, get out and pray that it's not in winter. Pray that you're not pregnant during that time. So if somebody died in Jerusalem as a Christian, whose fault was it? Well, it was their own fault for not paying attention. If these people were not prepared, that's not to say that they weren't going to suffer, even if they were prepared, but if they weren't prepared for that suffering, it's because of what? They didn't heed the warning. They had 200 or 300 years of Daniel, of preparation from Daniel to get ready for this. If they didn't heed the warning, if they didn't prepare for that, if their faith wasn't ready for that, they're going to either compromise and become a part of the problem, or likely even lose their life because of it. But because you lose your life because of it doesn't mean that you weren't prepared for it. It just means you didn't give up. Somebody prepared Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, and Daniel to be the people they were in Daniel chapter 1, 2, and 3. Somebody prepared them for that. Their mothers, the priests, the prophets, somebody prepared them for that. Daniel's trying, or the angel is trying to do the same thing for these people coming in the next 200 or 300 years, so that the people of God don't disappear completely from the face of the earth. Let me continue reading this quote. Consequently, it may be observed that this chapter speaks to more than merely the life and heady times of Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes. Its lessons are for all generations of true believers. Occasionally in history there will rise up ambitious rulers who will commit themselves in all the power of government to fulfilling their wishes over the inclinations, religious or otherwise, of those who are subject to them. They, that is, those leaders, are not concerned for right or wrong. Antiochus, therefore, may be viewed as a sort of prototype of many who unfortunately are destined to come after him. And we can read our history books and even our current day and time to find those men. For as long as this world shall stand, they shall come after him. Like there will be many men like Antiochus come. It is for this reason, guys who are taking the test, this is a good point to hear. It is for this reason that the vision is given. His methods and the progress of his horrific work show that God is ultimately in control, using men to accomplish his own purpose. He allows such evil tyrants to test his people for a time, but he breaks their power eventually and finally casts them into hell where they belong. In the end, divine justice will prevail. Let me repeat that again. In the end, divine justice will prevail. Because why? God is in control. That's not to say that he doesn't allow inequities to take place. He doesn't allow tyrants to come to the front, but there's a reason why he does that. I may not always know the reason, what his purpose, what his particular purpose in a particular tyrant coming to the throne is, but I know that if he's there, God put him there and he had a reason for it. Antiochus is there. He didn't take over. He wasn't bigger than God. He thought he was. He called himself Antiochus Epiphanes, which means what? Anybody know what that word Epiphanes means? It's not part of his name. It's a title. What's an epiphany?
An epiphany.
Epiphany. What is it?
It's like
an appearance. Something appeared. I had an epiphany. Something appeared. Well, that's what he said. I am the appearance of God. That's what he was saying. I am God who has appeared. That's who he thought he was, Antiochus. And that's some of the blasphemy that that we'll read about in a couple of verses if time will allow, which I think it will. Where did I get off here at? He allows such evil tyrants to test his people for a time, but he breaks their power eventually, finally casts them in hell where they belong. In the end, divine justice will prevail. Such men represent only temporary obstacles to the divine purpose in the world, even though it may seem otherwise for a few short but painful years. That is the lesson we must learn from Epiphanes. He makes a statement that I don't necessarily agree, or he words it in a way that I don't necessarily agree. He says, such men represent temporary obstacles to divine purpose. God uses these men and their choice to be wicked. It's not an obstacle for God. Maybe I'm just misreading him. Maybe I'm thinking through it too much here. But Pharaoh was not an obstacle to God. Pharaoh decided what he wanted to be. He decided the road he wanted to take. So God used that to accomplish His purpose. It wasn't an obstacle. If Pharaoh had chose a different route, God would have chosen a different route to accomplish His purpose. But because Pharaoh chose that, it didn't become an obstacle to God. It was just, well, if that's the way you want to choose, then this is what I'll do. Same thing with Antiochus Epiphanes. He wasn't an obstacle for God. God doesn't have obstacles. He's omnipotent. He's omniscient. He doesn't have obstacles in that sense. He has no hurdles to jump over like you and I do. So I don't see it necessarily as an obstacle, but that may just be a semantics on my part that I'm trying too hard to.
What verse is this that you're speaking of, sir?
Well, I was just going from verse 21, where we have an introduction to Antiochus Epiphanes. This is where verse 21 is the place. Joe asked, what verse are we dealing with here to get this from? And Antiochus Epiphanes first finds his introduction to us in this chapter anyway. We saw him in chapter 8, but in this chapter we see him here in verse 21. And because that's where we see him, Joe, that's where I saw this quote about him from King's commentary, and I thought it was very appropriate.
Is it are you looking from? Are you reading from the King James version or the New King James version?
When I say King, I'm talking about an author, a commentary authored by a man named King, and I'm using the New King James version in the translation. But what I did is quote from King's book, and that what I read to you was not from the Bible, Joe. It was from King's book or commentary on the book of Daniel. Sorry about that.
Okay.
Putting the guy's name in there in the King James version, that probably confused everybody. But his name is. Let me get that. I told you I'd give you that information while ago, and I didn't do it. I'll go back to the front of the book, and his name is. Come on now, play right. Don't you hate it when computers won't play nice? It's Truth Commentaries, edited by Mike Willis, Mikewillis. But the author of this particular book on Daniel is Daniel H. King Sr. You Google all that information, and you should come up with it's called Truth Books, Guardian of Truth Foundation, CEI Bookstore, 220 South Marion Street, Athens, Alabama. www.truthbooks.net. That's where I went to get the copy of commentary on Daniel. Let me repeat that for you. www.truthbooks.net.
Truthbooks.net. Right.
He is very wordy. If this book were in print, and it may or may not be, I don't know, it has to be huge, but he's very wordy. He says he takes a long time to say what he's got to say, but what he has to say is generally pretty good, but he won't always be, in fact seldom is, in certain areas anyway, in agreement with Turner in the interpretation of the book. But that's where I got that particular quote from. And some of the other quotes that I gave to you. Verse 22, we have about 10 minutes left in class. I'm going to try to get through this as quickly as I can. Verse 22, we'll read down through verse 28. With the force of a flood, they shall be swept away from before him. The him there is Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And be broken, and also the prince of the covenant. The prince of the covenant. We'll talk about that in a minute, but just highlight that in your Bible. We'll try to figure out who he is in a minute. And after the league is made with him, he shall act deceitfully, for he shall come up and become strong with a small number of people. He shall enter peaceably even into the richest places of the province, and he shall do what his fathers have not done. The he in these verses is going to be predominantly Antiochus IV. We're not going to be switching back and forth from the kings anymore, or from all the generals anymore. He is the subject of the matter, Antiochus Epiphanes. The fourth. He shall enter peaceably into the richest of places of the province. He shall do what his fathers have not done, or his forefathers. He shall disperse among them the plunder, spoil, and riches, and he shall devise his plans against the strongholds, but only for a time. Remember that phrase, and it's going to repeat itself several times now throughout the duration of the book, chapters 11 and 12, but only for a time. He shall stir up his power and his courage against the king of the south with a great army, and the king of the south shall be stirred up to battle with a very great mighty army, but he shall not stand, for they shall devise plans against him. Yes, those who eat of the portion of his delicacies shall destroy him. His army shall be swept away, and many shall fall down slain. Both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil, and they shall speak lies at the same table, but it shall not prosper. For, here's the phrase again, the end will still be at the appointed time. It's not time for it to be done yet, so the end is not yet, so they're not going to be destroyed. While returning to his land with great riches, his heart shall be moved against the holy covenant, so he shall do damage and return to his own land. Some argue that these verses 22 through 24 are talking about the Jewish people and Antiochus Epiphanes' effect on them. Since the time of the Persians, the Jews have been allowed, since they let the Jews go home, the Jews have been allowed to be ruled by the law of the Torah and by a high priest. They couldn't have a king, but they could have a high priest. And some think the prince of the covenant there is the high priest Onan or Onias III, who was replaced by Antiochus IV because Onias would not compromise his convictions with Antiochus. And so Antiochus put in a guy who would, a non-Levitical priest who later assassinated Onias. Others think verses 22 to 24 have to do with Antiochus IV's exploits in Egypt, and that's what I think here. I don't think the Prince of the Covenant, although the things that Antiochus did against the high priest did happen, just as the historians will tell us, I don't think the Prince of the Covenant remark there is Onias III. I think it's the Prince of Egypt, who was also Antiochus IV's nephew. Remember the marriage between Ptolemy V and Cleopatra earlier that we talked about. This nephew had made a contract with Antiochus, basically a peace treaty, but he didn't keep the peace treaty. Instead of helping Antiochus, as he agreed to do, he allied himself with Rome. He allied himself actually with his brother, another nephew of Antiochus. Remember it says there in verse 27, both these kings' hearts shall be bent on evil. They shall speak lies at the same table. It shall not prosper. This is a family feud taking place between Antiochus IV and his two nephews in Egypt. He thought his two nephews would be for him. We're family. We can do this together. We become one, but I get to be the king. And they decided, nah, we don't like that idea. And so that became a problem. They go into war with each other again. And so the Prince of the Covenant there, I think, is a reference to the nephews, the princes, there in Egypt. Antiochus, after his nephews refuse to bow to him, he gets mad and he goes and fights against several Egyptian cities, takes several Egyptian cities, with the exception of Alexander, one of the main cities. And he did, according to verse 24, he shall do what his fathers have not done, nor his forefathers before him. His forefathers, the Syrian kings, have always wanted to go in and take over Egypt. And Antiochus IV all but did. He did what his forefathers had not done, what they wanted to do but could not. Antiochus IV is finally able, for the most part, to accomplish that. That is, to march successfully against Egypt. But it says only for a time there in verse 24. Whether you see these verses 22 through 24 as against Egypt or against the Jews, in either case, Antiochus wreaked havoc in both Egypt and in Palestine, and he did so with great success. There are historical events that correspond with the statements that we find in verses 22 through 28, and I wish we had time to go into all of them, but we don't. The main thing I want you to get here is it's only for a time. It's for the end of time, or end time was not yet appointed. In other words, God is in control. I'm giving you this vision, and I'm going to tell you what Antiochus is going to do, but understand this, it's only for a time, and that time isn't determined by Antiochus. It's determined by who? It's determined by God. And again in verse 29, he starts out, and at the appointed time. Who appointed that time? God did. Not Antiochus IV, but God did. God appointed the time. At the appointed time, he shall return and go to the south, but it shall not be like the former or the latter. For ships from Cyprus, that's Rome, the ships from Cyprus are ships from Rome, or Cyprus, or ships from Rome shall come against Antiochus IV, therefore he shall be grieved. In 168 BC, Antiochus attacked Egypt, again, not happy that his nephews had allied against him, not only with themselves but with Rome. This time, Roman ships came to the aid of the Egyptian nephews, the Ptolemies there, that were nephews of Antiochus, and the Roman envoy, the commander of the Roman fleet that came, he comes to Antiochus and he says, enough, you'll go no further. In fact, he says, you will go home. You got a choice, or you'll go home. And the guy, Antiochus, said, you know what, I'll think about that. And the envoy, I forget his name, he's got a big old long name, he took his staff and he drew a circle around Antiochus IV. He says, you'll make your decision before you leave the circle. And so, he not wanting to get involved with the wrath of Rome, he decides to go back home, but he didn't go back home happy. Now, think about where he was. He's in Alexandria, Egypt, or close thereabout, when the Roman envoy sent him back home. In order to get back to Syria, how does he got to go? How do you get from Alexandria to Syria if you're going by land?
Mediterranean coast.
You got to go through Palestine. You got to get through the Mediterranean coast, which involves Israel. Israel belongs to Antiochus IV right now, but he's not really happy with the Jews. They were a thorn in his flesh because he's trying to Hellenize them. Some of them were being Hellenized, but there were some who were not. So he goes back in a fury because he's embarrassed by Rome, he's insulted by Rome, and so he goes back in a fury. Verse 30 says, ships from Cyprus shall come against Antiochus IV, therefore he shall be grieved, and he shall return in a rage against the holy covenant, and he will do damage. So shall he shall return and show and show regard for those who forsake the Holy Covenant. Who's he showing regard for? Jews who forsake the Holy Covenant. You come with me and we'll be buddies, but if you won't forsake the Holy Covenant, it's bad news. And that's a lot about what chapter 12 was about, and I wish I had time to go into that, but I think we're going to run out of time. He shall, verse 31, and forces shall be mustered by him, and they shall defile the sanctuary fortress. They shall take away daily sacrifices and place the abomination of desolation that Jesus spoke about in Matthew 24. Those who do wickedly against the covenant, he shall corrupt with flattery. He corrupts them with bribes. But the people who know their God shall be strong and carry out great exploits. I think he's talking about the Maccabees there. And those of the people who understand, those of the people who are wise, shall instruct many. Daniel chapter 12 talks about those wise ones. Yet for many days they, who's they? Who's the antecedent of they? Verse 33, let me read it again. And those of the people who understand, those of the people who are wise, shall instruct many, yet for many days they shall fall by the sword. Who's falling by the sword? The wise ones, or the ones being taught by the wise ones. They shall fall by the sword, by flame, by captivity, and by plundering. Now when they fall, they shall be aided with a little help, but many shall join with them by intrigue, and some of those of understanding shall fall to refine them, to purify them, to make them white, until the time of the end, because it is still for the appointed time. God says that the time has been appointed to accomplish the purpose that I'm trying to accomplish. And during that time, even though you're faithful, many of you will lose your lives. My kingdom will not go away. My purpose will not go away. Understand, I'm with you, but there's going to be a lot of you who are going to lose your lives. Don't lose your faith. Does that sound like any time in our, not our generation, but in our time frame? The Christians of the first century, did God forsake them? The ones who were persecuted to death, those who were martyred unto death, did God forsake them? No. He didn't forsake these people then. He didn't forsake the Christians of the first century at that time, nor does he forsake us now. That doesn't mean that we will live. It doesn't mean that we won't die in persecution. It doesn't mean that we won't die a horrible death at the teeth of lions or at the claws of bears. It just means that God has not forsaken us. He didn't forsake the boys in the fire. He didn't just forsake Daniel in the lion's den. He let them live because he had continued purposes for them to fulfill. The Christian who died in the arena at Rome, he was no less protected by God than was Daniel and the three boys. Only God's purpose for that person had been served. God took him home. Understand that about how God works. We may not agree with it always, but understand that about how God works. He may cause you to survive through the trial because he has continued purpose for you. He needed Daniel, or was using Daniel to accomplish what we're doing right here, reading this book, or writing the book that we're reading. But there may be times when your purpose is filled and persecution is the means by which you're taken out of this world. Doesn't mean God's forsaken you. Because you have cancer and you're dying a horrible death doesn't mean God's forsaking you. Don't think of it in that way. It means you're going home. God's ready for you to come home. Your time is there, and our time is up. I'd hope to get into. I didn't think I'd actually get into chapter 12. I would really like to cover chapter 12 with you. Verses 40 through the end of the chapter, 45. It kind of confusing, and I think it's confusing because it doesn't make a clean break. But what he does, beginning in verse 40, is rehearse in a shortened verse. This is the short story. You get long story in the verses 22 through 39 is the long story of Antiochus's life, and then verse 40 until the end of the chapter is the short story. He just condensed it. He summarizes it for us. And then he goes into chapter 12 where we find a continuation of the vision is done, but things are getting wrapped up and we don't have time to go into that. Read your commentary. The Green Book by, you don't have a Green Book, you have it on paper, on internet, by Butler. He's going to give you a different version of chapter 12 than Turner will. Turner has some really interesting views. I don't agree with them all. I don't disagree with them all. If I take Turner by himself and read it, it all makes sense. If I take Butler and read it, it makes sense. If I take King and read it, which is even a third perspective, it makes sense. They don't agree with each other, but what they don't do, what they strive to do is good conservative scholars is they try to give us an interpretation which does not conflict with other clear passages of Scripture. They may not agree with each other, but they try not to disagree or conflict with other passages of Scripture in their interpretation. Guys, thank you so much for your attention and for being in class with me. I enjoyed the time together. I enjoyed the study that I had, or that I had to do over the past few weeks. It's been a blessing to me, and I hope that you've gained something from the book. I apologize that we did not finish the book, but read chapter 12 in your textbook. It's not going to be on the test other than what I asked you earlier. I need you to give me a reason why it's there as far as the purpose of the book of Daniel. But read your commentaries on that. Gain a perspective. See which one you agree with. See which one fits in well that doesn't contradict other passages of Scripture. Any questions or comments?
God bless, Brother Underwood.
Joe, it's good to see you again. Glad to have you in class again.
Good to see you.
I'll get you that test sometime this week, and whatever other requirements that you have been given, I'd have to go back to the syllabus and see what that is right now because my mind's blank. Get those into me at the required time that I gave you. I think I gave you an extra week because I shorted you a week at the beginning of class. So get those into me, and we'll go from there. Thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks, sir.
Thank you.
God bless.
God bless you as well. Bye-bye.